Shortly before the time of Christ, Strabo, who was born in 63 BC, a Greek geographer, talked about high chimneys of silver smelters on the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are. And these high chimneys were even then used to disperse heavy and deadly gases, so Sudbury is nothing new. And only a century later, the Roman architect Vitruvius described lead poisoning caused by industrial air pollution. And so it went on over the years, and by 1864, the United States ambassador to Italy, George Perkins Marsh, who wrote a landmark book called Man and Nature, wrote of avalanches and torrents that were caused by deforestation in the high Alps of France, and he talked of emergency measures that had to be passed by the legislature of that time to try to reforest denuded hills, to build check dams to stop runoff in the spring. The reason I'm using Marsh is that he's sometimes been identified as the father of land wisdom. From his travels, Marsh learned that human activity had already reduced some areas of the earth to, in his words, a desolation almost as complete as the moon. And he warned, and I think that this is the first warning we got of possible extinction, he warned that if we continued such, his words, criminal and improvident behavior toward the earth, the land would be reduced to shattered surface, and our species would be reduced to barbarism, maybe we're there, and perhaps even extinction. In the 1930s, Dr. Walter Clay Loudermilk, an honors graduate in soils and forestry, was authorized by the U.S. Soil Conservation Service to study the relationship of man to the earth in 28 countries on 4 continents, and to try to determine why formerly productive lands were converted into what he later called man-made deserts. In places such as Syria, he found that deforestation had caused the erosion of topsoil, and then the subsoil came down upon the topsoil, and then water swept the whole works away. He found that the entryways into houses were 6 feet above present ground level due to the extreme deforestation. The country had basically been killed. As a result of his studies, Dr. Loudermilk suggested on Radio Jerusalem in 1939 that we surely need an 11th commandment, one which would regulate man's obligation to this holy earth. Dr. Loudermilk wrote such a commandment. I have some copies of it here. Some of you might like a copy. And then we come to an American forester. In 1949, Sand County Almanac, which is called a conservation classic, was published. Aldo Leopold was the author, and Aldo Leopold proposed the adoption of a land ethic. This ethic, to get an idea of what an ethic is about, this ethic would put limitations on our freedom to exploit the earth as we see fit. In an earlier writing in the Journal of Forestry, in the American Journal of Forestry, he had simply suggested that conservation is a moral issue, and he wrote an article entitled that. He indicated that one of the problems in today's essentially urban world is that people no longer have a vital relationship with the land. To most people, he suggested the land is nothing more than a place between cities where crops grow. It was his basic contention that we have absolutely no right to destroy the integrity or the wholeness, the stability and the beauty of the land, and that is really what environmental ethics is all about. Leopold went on to say something I think was confirmed by Dr. Jovanovich a bit ago. Leopold said that the average citizen may think that scientists know exactly how nature works, but there are so many variable factors, the scientists are equally sure that they do not know exactly how nature works. Leopold added that scientists know that the biotic mechanism is so complex that its workings may never be fully understood. And because of this, he stressed that the best part of intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts, and this is what we're not doing, because the rate of species extinction throughout the world is quite phenomenal. Leopold also touched upon education, and I think that's relevant to this meeting. He criticized it by saying that it's not the volume of education that needs to be corrected, but the content. He stated that much of higher education avoids ecological concepts quite deliberately, and he also indicated that an understanding of ecology and the environment doesn't necessarily come from courses that are labeled environment. It may come from history or geography or even English. Perhaps the foundation of our whole problem, to try to get to one man who said a bit about what the cause is, the foundation of the whole problem was probably identified by the famous humanitarian Dr. Albert Schweitzer with his 3 PhDs and the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in Africa. Dr. Schweitzer contended that we are living in the age of the collapse of civilization. That's how he starts his book, The Decay and Restoration of Civilization, published in 1923. It is collapsing, he said, because we are trying to ignore the requirements of an ethical way of life. It was Schweitzer's view that we live in an over-organized society that leaves no time for independent thought or reflection. Keep them stupid. People are barraged with advertising, which can promote the silliest of statements and make them appear to be true. He claims that one can search throughout history and not find a similar time when people have so thoroughly ignored what they know to be true. Rachel Carson dedicated her book Silent Spring to Albert Schweitzer, who said, quote, "Man has lost the ability to foresee and to forestall and will end by destroying the earth." He concluded that we have to dig very deeply into ourselves and find spiritual strength, which in his words will, quote now, "create the power of understanding the truth that is really true, where at present nothing is current but propagandist truth." In short, we stand at an axial point in history. This was identified by Lewis Mumford. On the one side is extinction, and on the other side is a high level of civilization that man has never attained. In the words of Mahatma Gandhi, when he was asked what he thought of civilization, he said, "It would be nice." These are interesting times, and the truth of the matter is that we cannot borrow character in a crisis. We must develop the strength within ourselves to modify our own behavior, to be content with less, and to live the kind of lives in which we will have consideration for the entire besieged planet. We have to become the very, very finest sort of person we can be. When the conference began, we had a lovely choir lead us in the singing of "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee," and really that's what it comes to. We must, for the first time ever probably, stand on guard for the real Canada, not for the political systems or not for the economic gain that's measured in ever-increasing GNP. We must stand on guard for the land with its mountains, its lakes, its rivers, its streams, its water, its soil. And only by doing that can we guarantee any future for humankind. Thank you.
Boy, you had that timed right down to the wire.
I tried to say more.
Next, Graham Kenyon, Chief of Environmental Services of Cominco Limited.
Thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate Bob and School District Number 7 for this extremely ambitious conference. A very impressive array of speakers. I don't think I've ever seen such a concentration of environmental expertise in one place. I just hope you didn't all travel in the same airplane. Then I noticed something else. There's only one person here with the letters LTD after his name. I feel like an endangered species. Then I read the Vancouver Sun's recent survey on who is believed on environmental issues. And 2/3 of adults and grade 8 students said they believe little or nothing of what industry says. A quarter said they believe some, and the 10%, a precious 10%, said they believe most. With that kind of record, it's a wonder even I got invited. Seriously, I've worked in the environmental movement for over 20 years, and I've met all kinds of dedicated people who've contributed lots to the environmental cause. They wear all kinds of hats, including industry. It's convenient perhaps to quote industry on the one hand and environmentalists on the other as if they're inevitably in opposite camps. The media loves to do that, but the media thrives on the extraordinary. The ordinary fact is that industry is people, and people include
environmentalists. These people influence the policies and practices of the company they work for, whether they're on the shop floor worker, the environmental manager, or the senior executive. The industrial organization is simply a microcosm of human society. If I can preach to you for just one moment, particularly the younger people, as an environmentalist of 20 years experience, always keep an open mind. No matter what preconceived ideas you may have, listen constructively. If you're going to spend all of your time reacting to labels, you're never going to know what's underneath the wrapper. To the issue, the dictionary definition of ethics is moral principles or conforming to a standard of right behavior. Well, there's obviously no problem there. I'm sure there's nobody here that would admit to behaving wrongly, right? If everybody is so perfect, why are there so many problems? The title of this panel, Ethical Responses to Environmental Issues, implies that if we were all ethical, if we all did the right thing, then we'd all live happily ever after and the world would forever be a beautiful and perfect place. One of the most serious environmental problems facing this earth is the growth in human population. The answer to that is obvious and also obviously very moral. But nobody wants to stop doing that. And in many parts of the world, the poorest parts of the world, the high birth rate is the only way of assuring old age security. And are they wrong? Certainly in terms of a sustainable environment they are, but are they being immoral or unethical? My point is that there is more than one way of being right. It all depends on your point of view, your perspective, and what it is that you aspire to achieve. This conference has aspirations for the environment, and ultimately that's important to all of us, but there are many other conferences going on, each focusing on what they consider to be the most important issue that must be dealt with right now, or we face dire consequences. Somehow there has to be a balance. While it would be naive to think that we can exploit the earth indefinitely without suffering serious consequences in terms of environmental degradation, it's equally naive to think that we can sustain our standard of living with no impact on the environment. There is a cost to all of this. There is a cost in exploitation. There is a cost in preservation. There is a cost to improve the environment. There is a cost if we don't. There is a cost in doing something, and there's a cost in doing nothing. We can't ignore those costs. There are limited resources available to address all of the problems facing us today, and it's critically important that they be applied where they'll do most good. Right now, the environment is the bandwagon to be on, and anybody worth his salt's jumping aboard if they can find room amongst all of the righteous politicians that couldn't spell environment 5 years ago. But are the issues really any different from when I first got involved 20 years ago? I don't think so. Improved analytical techniques are giving us ulcers worrying about chemicals that we had never heard of back then, but they were there. Air pollution, acid rain, parks versus mining, water pollution, toxic chemicals, dams versus wild rivers, wilderness versus logging, acid mine drainage, waste disposal, urban encroachment. All that happened 20 years ago just as it is today. Same issues. So why is there such a state of environmental panic today? Maybe it takes perception of crisis to stimulate action, so in one way it's not such a bad thing. But on the other hand, this same perception of crisis can stimulate precipitous action that may not be at all in our best long-term interests. I'll give you a classic example. A few years ago, several kilometers of highway in Ontario were dug up and packed away in containers as hazardous waste because a transformer being trucked to Quebec leaked PCB-contaminated oil onto the highway. PCB is a very persistent chemical, and for that reason is gradually being regulated out of existence. But it's no more toxic than the dozens of other chemicals that backyard gardeners splash on their veggies every summer, notwithstanding this kind of garish publicity. I don't know how many millions of dollars that exercise in bureaucratic and political nonsense cost, but can you imagine what a country like Ethiopia could have done with that money? Is it fair to ask how many people died in such places because Canadians felt it was necessary to dig up that piece of highway? And we talk about ethical responses to environmental issues. My point is this: we need a sustained, rational action to deal with environmental issues. A runner whose goal is the marathon would be well advised not to break the 100-meter dash, record. We can't afford to react to hysterical pressure to do something simply because it's there, because it's fashionable, and because it's politically expedient. We must focus instead on preparing the blueprint for a program that is sustainable, that will deal with the real priorities and that will get things done in a rational and cooperative manner. The environment is the thread that runs through all of our lives and therefore is of paramount importance, but we can't neglect those other priorities of our lives and of the lives of others in less fortunate circumstances. Shelter, food, and clean water, these are essentials that we take for granted. Others only dream of them. I believe that's what the Common Future Report was really saying, not business as usual and not a hysterical crisis, but rather bringing people together around a consensus of protecting the environment while sustaining the enjoyment and the sanctity of life within it. That's an ideal almost as unreachable, but just as desirable as world peace, and how long have we been working on that? Everybody surely agrees with it, so why doesn't it happen? You can't beat people over the head and tell them to make peace. They have to want to do it, and they have to feel that they can do it without a risk of losing whatever they have and the opportunity to do better for themselves. The environment is no different. In fact, the challenge is more difficult because it doesn't have the immediacy of war, and the road to environmental peace is often obscured by technical jargon and economic complexities. But with planning and forethought and caring about what we do to the environment and to each other and working together to build understanding and consensus, we can meet that challenge. Industry is a powerful resource, a powerful agent for change, but it is still people. The values that influence industry decisions simply reflect the values of society. Industry will seek to achieve economic efficiency in what they do because their focus is still the bottom line. But let's not forget that that bottom line represents wealth, and that wealth is essential if we are to effectively address the environmental and social problems of the future. Undoubtedly, our institutions must change in the future, including industry. I cannot conceive of indefinite growth and expansion and consumption, which represents the foundation of industry as we know it today. But for now, what you see is what you've got. By all means, seek alternatives, but if you want things to happen now, if you want to see things done, as Monte was urging yesterday, then industry can be a powerful ally. It depends as much on your values as theirs, because ultimately they're the same.
Wonderful. Next, Dr. Mary O'Brien.
Ethics are beliefs about what is right and wrong turned into action. Perhaps our basic environmental ethic, with variations, is being careful with the world. It is defending, by action, the components of the world: individuals, species, habitats, ecosystems, rocks, space. But ethics are ultimately personal. For instance, it's meaningless for you to pronounce to someone else that it is, quote, right to defend the components of the world. Someone else can say, hey, that's not my ethic, that's yours. Don't tell me what my ethics are. Since many people and companies and governments do not yet adhere to the basic environmental ethic, our work as environmentally ethical people, that is, people who are actively defending the components of the world, requires getting other people to change their behavior when they are destroying part of the world. We cannot effectively defend the world by ourselves. We must enlist and depend on others to act carefully with the world. We may not have to depend on certain people choosing to change their behavior, but we do have to enlist the help of others, for instance, courts and legislators and consumers, to get those people to change their behavior. Ultimately, then, environmental ethics is social reform. We defend ancient forests or clear water only by getting other people to behave well toward rivers and fish and sky. Getting people, that is, agencies, multinational corporations, and consumers, to change destructive behavior, and changing public policy that protects destructive behavior is a large task, and so we must take excellent action. Our actions cannot be mediocre, spotty, desperate, despairing, last minute, or sloppy. Our actions must be superb, intelligent, sustained, informed, cheerful, and hopeful. Ann Herbert, an author in the U.S., once wrote down a question and answer she overheard among two of her friends. Question: but what would Gandhi have done in Nazi Germany? Answer: I don't know, but he wouldn't have left all the imagination and initiative up to Hitler. That is the responsibility of our environmental ethic, to not leave all the initiative up to those who are destroying parts of the world. Let me give an example. About 7 or 8 years ago, the Tasmanian Wilderness Society led a masterfully organized blockade against construction of a huge hydroelectric dam on a wild Tasmanian river. The blockade, which continued for a year, even as earth movers tore through the forest to build the roads, involved setting blockades of rubber rafts in the way of barges, standing before earth movers, and arranging for international media and inspired articulation of the needs of the region. But the Wilderness Society people always appeared in public in suits. They kept a supply of second-hand suits in their office. They could wear work clothes in the office, but they met the media and were arrested in suits. They were dumped into the water in suits. The reason? They figured they could more easily get middle-class people to join the direct action if those people could see, quote, respectable people like themselves doing direct action. They succeeded in involving a broad range of Tasmanians in the blockade, and they succeeded in stopping the dam. The point is that the Franklin blockade was thoughtfully and carefully designed to change people's behavior rather than merely desperately protest their destructive behavior. Bob Brown, the physician and lead spokesperson for the Wilderness Society during the blockade, was elected to the Tasmanian Parliament while he was in jail for blockade participation, and has since been joined by 4 other environmental independents who now run a coalition Tasmanian government with the Labour Party, and they are working to develop a sustainable Tasmanian economy. Which leads us to another critical component of being environmentally ethical: developing and articulating feasible alternatives to behavior that is destroying the world. To be successful at changing people's behavior, you often have to develop the plans, the proposals, and the strategies. You need to sit down and draft better agency regulations. You need to draft legislation for politicians. You need to prepare the recommendations for the school committee you're on. You need to go to the World Bank and present better guidelines for particular types of projects they fund. You have the responsibility for solving problems that others should have been solving. But again, your alternatives must be feasible, and the components of your proposals must be excellent. That generally means incorporating suggestions and ideas of others who are also environmentally ethical. In addition, being environmentally ethical involves personal risks. Sometimes in our work of defending the world, we decide to compromise and let a part of the world be lost. But by the same token, we and our organizations must also be willing to risk our organization's reputation or our own status. When we're in a compromise, no compromise situation, it must not always be the world rather than our organization's status or our job that gets protected. A final activist thought regarding excellence and initiative and risk. Excuse me, I said that backwards. It must not always be the world rather than our organization's status or our job that doesn't get protected. A final activist thought regarding excellence and initiative and risk. Could it be that we are environmentally ethical only to the degree that we are successful in defending the world? Thank you.
The next speaker, Cynthia Pollock-Shea.
Thanks, Norris. I thought it was interesting that Bob spent a lot of time this morning quoting Aldo Leopold. One of Leopold's other quotes, which I quite like, is that something is right when it tends to preserve the stability, integrity, and beauty of a biotic system. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. I think that says a lot, and it makes me proud to be from the University of Wisconsin, where Aldo Leopold was a professor of ecology. Unfortunately, he was there a bit before my time, but his ideas were still quite prevalent within the university community and very much appreciated. Another concept which I think is very important to take home is that we have not inherited the earth from our parents. We are borrowing it from our children. Not only are we borrowing it, we're not even paying any interest on what we're getting. In fact, just the opposite. Using the financial practices in place today, we actually discount the future. If interest rates were at 7%, for example, money today would be worth twice as much as that money 10 years from now. So the future is not given a priority in today's economic system. Fortunately, not all cultures take this approach. In fact, the Iroquois Indians frequently speak about the 7th generation. Whenever they make a decision on anything, they discuss what the implications of that action will be on people 7 generations hence. Unfortunately, most cultures today do not take this approach. They live for the moment and are unconcerned about the repercussions of their actions. But humans are undermining the natural systems on which we depend for survival. In fact, for the first time, humans are even altering the course of evolution. There have been mass species extinctions in the past, but those were caused by very slow changes in climate, or, as some scientists postulate, by meteors hitting the Earth and wiping out large numbers of species. Never before have species become extinct so rapidly, and because humans are eliminating the habitat on which the animals depend. Approximately 2 species are becoming extinct every day, and many of those have not even been discovered. In the tropical rainforest, where there's the greatest biological diversity on Earth, we have no idea what many of the plants and insects there do, how they function, what their purpose is, and what benefits they may provide to mankind. But we're annihilating the tropical forests. In fact, a football field of forest is eradicated every second. That's over 11 million hectares a year of tropical forest that's lost. There are also another of environmental trends underway, trends of which we cannot be very proud. The Earth's climate is warming, and because of the gases primarily emitted by human activities. Carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas, accounting for about 50% of the warming. Over 2/3 of that results from the burning of fossil fuels. The remainder is from denuding of forests, The other greenhouse gases are chlorofluorocarbons, methane, nitric oxide, and water vapor. As the climate continues to warm, we're going to see a lot of changes in natural systems. Sea levels will rise, wiping out coastal communities. Agricultural patterns will change as the hydrological system changes. There have been incredible investments made in irrigation for agriculture around the world, and it's estimated that over $200 billion will have to be invested to alter those irrigation systems to compensate for the climate warming, which will result within the next century. Forests will also move to more northerly climes as temperatures rise, as will agriculture, but it's unclear whether the more northerly soils will be able to, are rich enough to be able to support those stocks of forest and agriculture. Water supplies will also be impaired, and we'll move from discussing things like endangered species to endangered nations. The country of the Maldives is a series of islands, none of which are more than a couple hundred feet high, and the president of the Maldives recently made an impassioned speech to the United Nations talking about the prospect that his nation could be wiped off the face of the earth. We're also eroding the ozone shield that protects us from ultraviolet radiation. The chlorofluorocarbons and halons that are eroding the ozone shield are allowing more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. That will result in increased skin cancer cases, in cataracts, in depressed immune systems, depressed crop productivity, and elimination of marine species, or at least decreased productivity that will affect the marine food chain and ultimately the humans that eat marine products for protein. We're also allowing millions of tons of precious topsoil to wash off every year because of unsustainable farm and forestry practices, thus imperiling our future world food prospect. The list goes on, but the point is that the remedies to these problems require a long-term outlook, not just living for today. It's difficult enough for the average person to think about what the implications of their actions will be decades or generations hence, but it's even more difficult in this system for politicians who are always thinking no further than the next election. We've got to change that and force people to think beyond the next election. Also, we have to change the thinking of businessmen, many of whom are concerned about a distance only as far away as next quarter's financial results. They're abandoning 5-year plans, even 1-year plans in many instances, and simply focusing on the next quarter. That's not long enough to take into account the environmental implications of their manufacturing processes and the products that they make. To remedy this, we need to take an accounting of the environment too. We've got lots of financial statistics readily available to us, GNP figures, etc. But GNP counts as a positive things like the amount of money spent to clean up pollution, or the amount of natural resources mined and used every year. It does not take into account the negative repercussions of these practices. A new accounting system that would reflect our values and protect and reflect the long-term viability of natural systems is urgently needed. Some of the factors that could be looked at are the amounts of energy used to produce a dollar's worth of GNP. Already in Japan, twice as much GNP is produced per unit of energy used as in the United States, and 3 times as much as in the Soviet Union. Some other elements that would be included in the accounting system are whether or not we use ozone-depleting chemicals, the number of species being endangered, how fast forests are being denuded as opposed to being replaced. And in fact, there we would not just want a balance, we would want more forests to be planted than are cut down, because forests act as a sink for carbon dioxide and slow global warming. We'd also want to look at things like the rate of soil formation versus soil lost, and change farming practices so that no more is lost than is formed. Also looking at groundwater sources, looking at the ratio of groundwater used versus groundwater recharged and not exceeding the natural balance in terms of consumption. All of these factors need to be taken into consideration if we're going to have a viable future. Thanks.
I must say you're all being very good about the time. You're all right on the nose. You must have timed yourselves, did you? I have no idea. No? All right, our next speaker and wrapper-upper, as Bob says, Monte Hummel.
Thank you. I'd like to come at this a little differently. Usually this whole topic of environmental ethics is considered in terms of human beings' attitudes towards nature or towards the environment, and we're looking at our ethical commitment to the planet. And this has been traced through the history of philosophy. Bob has indicated a few of these trends. Questions have been asked, wherein do these somewhat distorted and unacceptable attitudes originate? For example, Aristotle, a long time ago, wrote about the categories of human understanding. How do we perceive and understand the world? And his point of view has been suggested that people only understand the world by controlling it and manipulating it in some way. Descartes has been accused for laying the foundations for modern science, which again is one of manipulating or controlling the world, rather than accepting it and respecting it. The existentialist philosophers, such as Heidegger, criticized humanity for our preoccupation with what he called dominating the planet by technique. And Lynn White wrote a very interesting article tracing our wrong attitudes and bad ethics, if you want, to some of our religious traditions, again suggesting that the orientation from the Bible itself has been to dominate rather than to roll with the planet. We've also asked questions about focusing on what we want rather than what we need. So in the course of all this, people emerge as pretty miserable beings. And I think we're in danger of disliking people, of becoming what's known as misanthropes, people who hate people. I'd like to urge us, when we consider our ethical commitment to the environment, to maintain our humanity in dealing with each other, and to ask about the ethical commitment that we have to people when we're tackling environmental problems. To give you a few examples, the seal hunt, which is an issue that almost automatically divides everybody in the room into two camps, no matter what you say about it, in my view, told us much more about people's attitudes towards people than it did about people's attitudes towards the environment. Disrupting the religious services of the Newfoundland sealer on the docks, I think, demonstrated some really unacceptable intolerance to a culture other than that of urban Canada. When you look at what happened to the Eastern Arctic Inuit communities as a result of the ban on the exporting of seal pelts, the suicide levels, the employment levels, again, it demonstrated somewhat of an insensitivity to a culture other than our own. We didn't really look at the role of people in some cases. I think Jeff Gibbs' slideshow about the Kayapo in the Amazon makes a very strong appeal to be concerned about people and people's dependence and people's role in the environment when we're talking about the environment as well. A very explosive issue is population growth. Here in Canada, a significant portion of our domestic growth is attributable to immigration. When we look at immigration levels, and these were debated in the House of Commons this week, I think that environmentalists have to be very careful not to descend into racial prejudices, but to look seriously at whether we should have a population policy in Canada related to its impacts on the environment, and not, as I say, get dragged into attitudes that reflect a dislike of people. In dealing with decision makers, whether they're politicians or corporate executives, and even when we're dealing with foresters or people who advocate a hard energy path, I think we have to remember and understand and accept that people that we disagree with are often, if not always, also operating out of what they consider to be good intentions and what they genuinely and honestly believe to be right for society, if not the environment. Dr. Yanovich and I disagree on hard path versus soft path. I do not think the future resides with nuclear power, but I don't dispute or doubt for one moment that he and I both sincerely believe that the points of view we're advocating are best for humanity, and I think we respect each other for that. To paraphrase Elizabeth May, if you expect the worst from people, you'll get it. And if you treat people like demons, or if you demean them or patronize them, they know it and will not work with you or cooperate to protect the environment or to do anything else. I'm not saying that there aren't tremendous anti-environment forces let loose on the globe. There certainly are. I'm also not saying that we aren't engaged in a very fundamental power struggle. We are. And I'm not saying that there aren't attitudes that have to be changed or re-examined. There certainly are. But let's try to nourish what's good in people. Education was derived from the Latin to lead out, educate. I think we should try to nourish what's good in people and draw what's good in people and not sort of descend into the depths of being misanthropes. In trying to protect the planet, let's give people the benefit of the doubt more often than we have in the past, and understand that we're trying to save the planet not just for its own sake, not just for wildlife, and not for other living passengers, not just for other living passengers, but we're also trying to save it to better the future of people. Thank you.
Well, that's probably the most power-packed panel I have ever had the fortune or misfortune to moderate. I must say, that's impressive. And now I think we should take our coffee break. How are we for time? Before the workshops, we're only running 10 minutes late. We have picked up some time, so you have 20 minutes for your workshop.
Any questions, moderator?
Oh, you want questions? All right. Who do you want to direct questions to? Do we have a roving mic? Yeah, we do. Everyone has to hear the question. Come down, please, over to the microphone if you want to ask questions.
Please, can you tell us how we set about putting an end to the acid rain, which is devastating such a large area of this country and in the American Northeast also?
All right, Monte Hummel.
I said in my talk that the steps that needed to be taken to acid rain, to control acid rain were known, so I think I should try to answer that question. The Canadian Coalition on Acid Rain identified 3 major sources in Canada. The first was automobiles, and we had very specific steps that we were trying to take to control particularly NOx emissions from automobiles. The second major point source in Canada was industrial sources, and we went after sources such as the International Nickel Company. And the third major point source was thermal electric utilities. So we had a 3-point agenda that was very specific. We knew exactly what we wanted in terms of legislation to control those sources. And I think it's fair to say that in Canada, we've done the lion's share of controlling those sources. The second part of the puzzle, of course, is to get the Midwestern United States to get a higher level of awareness of acid rain in the United States on the part of the U.S. public, and some action by the U.S. Congress in terms of legislation. And in my view, at last, we're starting to get that on the U.S. side. So in a very direct answer to your question, those are the steps which the coalition identified. I think we're about 3 of 4 steps down the way. We're now monitoring and watching very closely to make sure that the commitment on the U.S. side does meet targets and timetables, as I mentioned yesterday.
Did I do?
Yes.
I think it could be mentioned that there's been a lot of talk, like Dr. Jovanovich mentioned, the route of going the coal-fired generating way. And there are plants like the James M. Gavin plant in Ohio that burns 10,000 tons of coal an hour. It's caused rainfalls in Wheeling, West Virginia, as low as pH 2.5, which is between 1,000 and 10,000 times as acid as normal. And in addition, the U.S., I believe, has identified something like 50,000 respiratory deaths per year, which are attributed to acid rain. So again, one of the things that we are seriously having to look at here is this whole difference in energy paths. I'm not making any recommendations because I don't think I really know the answers as to what energy path is the safest. But one thing that certainly could be looked at is that the U.S. has done more with energy conservation, has saved more money with energy conservation in the last few years than with any other thing. And that the root of energy conservation is one that we haven't mentioned, like cutting our energy consumption by 20, 30, or 40%.
Where is the microphone? Stand up. Oh, you are.
Does this work? Does the microphone work? Okay, my question's for Cynthia. Here in British Columbia, we take hemlock chips and make hemlock chips, and we take them all the way to Bellingham. Then we pick up the garbage and bring it back to Cache Creek. And then over in Williams Lake, now we're building a big generating plant so we can burn wood waste. And a little closer to home here in Castlegar, they're going to double the size of the pulp mill and cut the pollution by 50%, which is going to pollute about the same anyway. And just east of here, Fording Coal, I don't think Cominco owns that, but it's high sulfur coal, and what they want to burn there is, put in there is generate coal. My point is, and also these other wood waste plants that they plan to build to generate electricity, they also plan to build something because industry thinks they're going to recycle by burning RDF, refuse-derived fuel. So I guess my question is, how do we stem the greed? How do we ever get recycling initiated in British Columbia when we're burning the garbage?
Those were all very good questions. I think it stems back in part to what I was discussing earlier and a better way of valuing resources and economic activities. Generating electricity, which also generates air pollution, water pollution, emits carbon dioxide that is warming the climate. That's considered as a positive activity under today's financial standards. What we need to do is also have an accounting to take into consideration the environmental implications of our actions and get to an energy strategy which looks at the amount of true goods, beneficial products made available for given amounts of energy used, and to try and minimize that. That means more energy conservation would be practiced. That means more renewable resources would be used instead of coal and oil. That means that more materials would be recycled because it's much more energy efficient to recycle them than it is to either burn them or dispose of them. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's an awareness that a lot of people are feeling comfortable with now, but unfortunately it hasn't reached the politicians and it hasn't reached a lot of industry. But if it has reached you, tell them about it, and that'll help to change it.
I guess I really want to know too why industry is not talking about closed systems.
A lot of places aren't. There are some companies that are, and it is changing. I mentioned the 3M company yesterday with its pollution prevention pays, reducing emissions of waste. Some of the other large chemical companies are engaging in the same programs, partly because They have a lot of capital right now, partly because they have advanced technologies, partly because they have been the subject of much public scrutiny in recent years and have a very bad public image, partly because of the higher costs of waste disposal. There are a number of different factors that are driving it, but companies like DuPont plan to reduce their emissions of hazardous waste 35% by 1990, duplicate that over the next decade. They're finding that their costs of pollution control are less, that they don't have future liabilities to clean up hazardous waste sites. If you don't emit it, you don't have to clean it up later. It's starting to change. It certainly has to go a lot further, but I think that industry is starting to look at these issues, and some companies are starting to act.
Just one point for the man from Cominco is that we've already put 16,000 tons of PCBs into our environment here in Canada, and PCBs are a carcinogen, and they also bioaccumulate in your fat, so if they don't hurt you, when your grandson comes along and tells you you can't get it up, what are you going to do?
Mr. Kenyon.
I'm not going to answer that last, presumably rhetorical question. But you kind of skipped over one item there that I think illustrates the reality of the situation. You referred to the pulp mill at Castlegar. I'm not that familiar with the details of that, but I know for certainty that pulp mill at the end of their expansion will not emit the same amount of pollution that it's doing now. They simply would not be permitted to do that under the present climate of today. They have environmental problems associated with that pulp mill, and they are having to fix them up, and a lot of pressure to fix them up. So in order to fix them up, again, I'm not that familiar with it, presumably their answer is, in order to afford the pollution abatement equipment to solve that problem, they have to increase the production of that plant to pay for it. As I referred to earlier on, there's a cost to all of this. I doubt if that pulp mill could continue operating under the new imposition of environmental regulations with its present older operating production rates and older operating equipment. They have to upgrade in order to solve the pollution problems, and in the process of doing that, they're going to increase production to pay for that improvement.
Over here.
I'm not sure if I have a question, but at least a comment, and I can really appreciate what Monte Hummel is saying about learning and seeing the best in people, but what I've seen also happening in this conference is that, especially from Cynthia Pollock, is that I feel a perpetuation of the myth that, let's say, definitely the Japanese are doing so great and so good in this world, but if you look at what they're really doing as a destruction in the rainforest, how hard they want to change, let's say, the drift net fishing, how hard it was for them to change the whale killing and all that stuff. I feel it's a very important that we look in what we can do and offer what we as a society here can do, instead of taking a picture which is a half picture from a country who's doing a lot of wrongs in this world, and not trying to perpetuate that whole myth of they are the greatest in what they're doing. I don't believe that. I don't accept that.
I fully agree with you. I didn't mean to paint the picture of the Japanese as doing everything right by any means. I referred to them in terms of the recycling programs which they're engaged in, and their recycling programs are the most advanced in the world at this point. Also, when they were suffering from major air pollution problems domestically in the early 70s, they advanced pollution control technologies, and they started using energy much more efficiently. Domestically, they're doing some things right. Internationally, they have a terrible record in most environmental areas. They import much of the tropical timber being cut down around the world and use it for things like chopsticks. I mean, you don't need mahogany for a chopstick. They also use drift net fishing. They are now the #1 lender to developing countries, which is good that they're recycling their money, but the projects they fund are often environmentally destructive. Internationally, they have a bad record. They have to clean it up. The Japanese don't tend to be aware of these issues yet. When you do opinion polls in Japan, people say that the government's doing a good job, that industry's doing a good job. They're not environmentally aware yet. I think as they become a greater player in the international community, though, because of their economic clout, that political pressure will be put on them to change their actions.
And this summer, they polluted the Bow River from Banff. It was so overloaded. Yes.
My comment is related to environmental impact assessment, and I think that we've often thought of environmental impact assessment as being something that applies to particular projects, such as the new pulp mill and the pulp mill expansion in Castlegar, but I think it's time that we began to look at the environmental impact of consumer products, or basically the ways that we spend our money. And this applies both to individuals in terms of whenever you buy a particular product, but also, and I think on a strategic basis, very importantly right now, is for large organizations like corporations and governments to be developing procedures to examine the environmental impact of the way they spend their money. That includes for federal governments making large transfer payments to provinces and what the provinces do with that money. But it also includes things like, well, to bring it back to pulp mills, for the federal government to say as a minimal acceptable standard, for example, that they won't buy any paper products that are made from pulp mills that don't comply with environmental standards. I think in addition to that kind of minimal acceptable standard, we also need environmental standards on products that are the cutting edge, the leading desirable kinds of standards, and that governments as environmentally responsible consumers could have an enormous impact if they started to say that we will buy the products that meet the desirable standards as soon as they're available.
One thought on that, when I hear you say, you know, they should do environmental assessments, I always come back, you know, sort of obsessively to the activist position that, you know, citizens are now getting more and more skilled in being able to do environmental impact statements and environmental assessments themselves, and we can do assessments of what the government is doing. In other words, we don't have to just write them a letter and say, please do an environmental assessment of what you're doing. We have to take it on ourselves to do the environmental assessments ourselves sometimes too. Report cards on them and our consumer activities.
I just have a couple comments in response to the questions and comments as well. One, I don't know if all of you are familiar with the Environmental Choice Program that Environment Canada is sponsoring. They will be issuing regulations as to what products can carry the Environmental Choice logo, the maple leaf and the doves, and the ones that they have already approved are recycled oil, some recycled paper products, and there's a third, who knows what it is. But they're going to be approving more and more, and those will be labeled so that consumers know they're more environmentally friendly. Also, as you said, government's buying things, government procurement is really important. Corporations, as far as environmental analysis, need to look at product development, research and development, marketing, etc., to look at the environmental implications of what they do. Loblaws, superstores, I think, are doing a great marketing job now with their green product line. You may disagree with some of the merits of the products that are in the line, but I think it's a tremendous initiative that more and more companies will try to copy, and overall that movement is quite positive.
Well, yes.
I'd like very quick comment on your transfer payments from the federal government. Right behind our largest area of federal expenditures, paying back the interest on our national debt, but the second largest area of expenditure is transfer payments to the provinces in one way or the other. And I think you are really onto something when you suggest that if you want to transfer environmental ethics into something specific, that we should start putting some environmental riders on those transfer payments, whether they're for forestry programs, because there are tremendous volumes of money go from the federal government to the provinces, for public health programs and for economic development. I think that is something we've not made a serious inroad into in Canada, and it's a very, very good point.
If I could just add one comment to that. One of the things that follows from what I've suggested is that we're going to have to know whether things are made in accordance with environmental standards. And the status quo is that you may be or may not be able to find out on a one mill or one situation by situation basis, but there is almost no collection of that kind of data on a basis that would allow certification, and that is absolutely unbelievable in this state of computerized technology, that there's no way of for example, finding out quickly how any particular industry is doing in terms of compliance with environmental standards. And we're going to have to be able to do that in order to make these decisions about what products meet environmental standards.
No question. Go ahead, sir. You're next. Come on down to the mic, please, if you want to speak. You're on.
We seem to be in an era of intense individualism, and part of what characterizes that approach is that we always take ourselves as starting points. And even though we're trying to think more globally, there's an essential question that comes to my mind that I like perhaps people to grapple with, and that is, what is the place and function of humanity within this planet Earth? Because I think by only answering that question that we can really truly start to relate to what our environment is and what our responsibilities are to the environment. And from that point of view, that question, we don't take humanity as the starting point in terms of standards of living that we want and things like that. I mean, how is it that we're supposed to interrelate and interfunction with other life forms on this planet?
That is a heavy one. Who wants to tackle that? Bob?
Well, I just would mention on that this is something that, again, Monty mentioned earlier, Aristotle started the concept many, many years ago, 2,000 years ago, of the great chain of being, and he hypothesized that we are a creature somewhere in the middle, that there are just as many creatures above us as below us in the universe, but we don't comprehend this because we have a very limited comprehension of the universe because of the fact that we're a mid-range species. And Alexander Pope also went on from there, and he wrote the entire essay on man, having to do with just that fact, that man is a creature of middle state. And he suggested that if man did the things that were really within the scope of man, he would have no problem. But when man gets too big for his britches, as he obviously has, then he has very, very serious problems. And Pope just basically stated in 2 lines, he said, we're parts of one stupendous whole whose body nature is in God the soul. And so one other person maybe has commented there, what you're talking about is the fact that we have what Robert Ardrey called the illusion of central position. We think we're it. And until we get off this illusion of central position and come down to the fact that we are here and we share life with all these other creatures, we haven't a hope. And this is why I think that we have a primarily ethical construct to create within our own minds.
I believe Mary wants to make a comment.
One
Yes,
comment?
I'm sorry.
Thinking along these lines, I've had a sort of quandary. I've realized that in my personal life, I am moved greatly when I switch my mind and talk to a tree, or, say, as Native Americans have often, the grasshopper is my sister, which our society just doesn't do very much. But the amazing power of that action is that you like that tree very much. You like that grasshopper very much. And you come to realize that we're just one of many friends on Earth. And the quandary I have is, given that that's not the standard way of looking at organisms other than ourselves in our society, by what way can you transfer the power of that to the society? In other words, what I'm trying to say is, it drives my work a lot. I mean, that's why I do the work I do, because insects are funny, you know, and trees are lovable. So getting back to what I mentioned, that we work with cheerfulness, I think part of our role has got to be not merely pointing out to people the damage we're doing, but always somehow in our work conveying to them the wonder of the world that we're working for. Because our psychology, people's psychology is such that they hurt inside when they hear about acid rain and pollution and loss of forests and loss of peoples. They hurt. And it's hard to act on the basis of hurt. When I realize that I act on the basis of incredible, intense affection, we always need to remember in our work somehow to convey that joy and the cheerfulness and the wonder of the world, so that people are also somehow motivated to work for it.
So we're going to have to approach change. So we'll be more effective in effecting change if we have a positive, loving attitude toward everything. Mr. Kenyon.
Including senior executives of corporations. And I guess this is kind of industry point of view to this, and it relates to what I was talking about earlier on, that industry is nothing more than an institution that was kind of developed by humans, humanity, people, in order to achieve certain things, and it's achieved a lot over the years. But it's kind of evolved now, particularly within the present sort of adversarial atmosphere, into an abstract. You know, there's industry, which is some abstract thing. But I can emphasize again that it isn't. Industry is made up of people just like the people sitting around here. They don't become robots when they go into executive boardrooms, so that when you're dealing with industry, as you're going to have to in the future in terms of resolving some of these problems, deal with them as people. The senior executives of corporations go out and hike around in the mountains and canoe and play golf and do all of those things the same as you do. And so just deal with them as people, and I'm sure you'll succeed a lot better than bashing away with clubs at this great abstract called industry.
Take the chairman of the board out for a weekend in Bush.
Could I just put one thing?
Yes, Bob. We've got to cut this. You guys are going on too long, and we've got people who want to... However, we'll discuss that in a moment. Carry on.
Graham, the truth of the matter is, seriously though, we really do love industry, and it's not hard because the root of the word that's used in the biblical statement, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, is agape. And agape does not mean, intense emotional love. It means to have creative, redeeming goodwill. And it is very desirable that we should love industry in the sense that we have creative, redeeming goodwill to help industry recreate itself. And one of the things that I think of often is that industry, or technology more specifically, is like a baby stewing in its diapers. It's still in swaddling clothes. And an interesting thing is that Cominco itself, because of an international suit at one time, developed elephant brand fertilizer, which has been a very, very good market. And I think industry just has to come to realize that environmentally positive action would probably result in extremely high profits, but we have not yet really started looking in that direction because we chop and change and move along too fast. Just a thought.
Thank you. That takes up too much time. Save that for later. What Mary O'Brien just said is why we call the conference Get High on Nature. Now, you have a decision to make. It's your conference. You can cut the coffee and allow the panel to go on for another 10 minutes, get your coffee on the run, and then go to your workshop right at 11.
Elizabeth May.
All right. Right, Elizabeth May. What is your wish? Do you want to cut it off now?
Yes.
How many want to cut it off now?
That's a lot of people.
How many want to continue? You've only got about 5 minutes. It's a split vote. Coffee has it. Thank you all.
No. I have an important question to ask. I'd like to ask it before everybody leaves. And it isn't a question that the panel has to answer at this moment. This is a youth-type, school-orientated conference. And up till now, I'm a little afraid that this may be, being that we have a panel here, our last chance to ask questions in a group like this. Up to now, I'm afraid all I've heard at this conference is questions from adults, and I haven't heard of questions from the youth yet. What are their problems, and what are their questions?
We have been encouraging questions from youth, sir. They must get up to the microphone. Elizabeth May will give you a half an hour for questions. All right.
Some really informative speakers from all over. It's a really good experience.
How do you think the young people
are affected by this?
Are affected by this conference?
I don't know. It increases their awareness, I think, a little. It's really informative.
Did it give you any hope? Did it give you any hope?
A lot of hope. Yeah, it cleared a lot of things in my mind too. A lot of ideas that kind of in my mind, but they weren't clear enough to express. It's definitely
Lots of good information, eh?
Yeah, lots of good information, almost too much, you know.
Did you go to many workshops?
Yeah, went out to all that I could.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
So,
talk louder.
Okay. The conference today was about, we had a council of about 4 or 5 speakers that came together inside of the table and discussed different issues on the environment. And listening to them, it was kind of neat to get different points of view from the different people. They all have sort of different responsibilities in Canada for with the environment, and they all have different points of view and ideas. Cynthia Pollock-Shea and Monte Hummel are a couple of the speakers there that I've heard of before, and I've listened to both of them workshops they have in the rooms upstairs, and they've both been really good, and they seem like they know their stuff.
Have you ever been to anything like this before?
No, I've never been to a workshop before. I've been to see people speak before, but not in a large sort of convention like this.
How do you think it was a good thing?
Yeah, I think it's really good. It gives people in an area similar ideas so that they can get together after and put together some schemes maybe for groups or new organizations, because they've all had similar experiences. It's better than individual people learning different things.
So you feel inspired and hopeful?
Oh yeah. Well, it's really neat. And the information itself, this is really interesting.